Imagine living next door to a man who seemed perfectly ordinary, quiet, even friendly. But behind closed doors, he harbored unspeakable horrors. Jeffrey Dahmer, one of America's most notorious serial killers, lured innocent victims with promises of money and a safe place to stay before turning them into his grotesque trophies. How did this ordinary man transform into a monster? Stick around as we unravel the chilling truth. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer began in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a small city in the heart of America. Born on May 21st, 1960 to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, his childhood appeared ordinary at first glance. But beneath the surface, a dark and disturbing foundation was being laid. The events of his early years, intertwined with family struggles and his own growing sense of isolation, would eventually culminate in a life of horror and destruction. Jeffrey's parents, Lionel and Joyce, were deeply troubled individuals whose marriage was strained from the beginning. Lionel, a chemist, was an intelligent but distant man, often consumed by his demanding work in the field of research. He was emotionally unavailable, leaving Jeffrey to grow up without the firm guidance or emotional support a father should provide. Joyce, on the other hand, had her own struggles. A woman with a fragile mental state, she battled mental health issues, including depression and a deep sense of emotional instability. This created an environment of constant tension in their household, which affected Jeffrey deeply. As a young child, Jeffrey was quiet and introverted, often withdrawing from the world around him. He struggled to make friends, and his classmates would later recall him as being the weird kid, often seen playing by himself. This early sense of alienation created a lasting feeling of loneliness and despair, which would only deepen as he grew older. Jeffrey's social difficulties were compounded by his parents' inability to communicate with one another and their growing emotional distance. The instability at home left him to fend for himself emotionally, and there was little guidance or support to help him navigate the challenges of growing up. This lack of emotional warmth and security would be one of the most significant factors contributing to Dahmer's eventual descent into darkness. At just 10 years old, Jeffrey's interest began to take a disturbing turn. He became fascinated with dead animals, a fascination that would eventually manifest in his grotesque acts later in life. His first encounter with death involved the discovery of roadkill, which he eagerly collected. Instead of being repulsed or saddened by the sight of a dead animal, Jeffrey was intrigued. He began to dissect these animals in his backyard, using tools to examine their organs and study their anatomy. This obsession with death and dissection grew stronger as he entered his teenage years, and it became clear that his interests were no longer innocent childhood curiosities, but signs of something much darker brewing inside him. By the time Jeffrey was a teenager, his behavior had become even more erratic. His fascination with death evolved into an obsession, and he started to experiment with increasingly disturbing behaviors. He became more withdrawn and isolated, and the small circle of friends he had disappeared entirely. Jeffrey's need for connection and attention grew stronger, but instead of turning to healthier outlets like therapy or friendships, he spiraled deeper into his dark interests. His mental state was deteriorating, and his desire for control and power over others began to take shape. During this period of emotional instability, Jeffrey's alcohol consumption became a coping mechanism. He began drinking heavily in his teenage years, and alcohol seemed to numb the pain and confusion he felt. His drinking continued into his adult years and was often a central part of his interactions with others. Whether it was to escape the emptiness he felt or to enhance the thrill of his disturbing interests, alcohol played a significant role in his life. At school, Jeffrey's increasingly erratic behavior made him a target for bullying and ridicule. His classmates noticed how he kept to himself, rarely engaging in social activities, and would often act out in strange ways. He would pretend to laugh in an odd manner, which only served to alienate him further. Despite his outward awkwardness, Dahmer had moments of charisma that allowed him to blend in with others at times, but these moments were fleeting and superficial. He could never escape the feeling of being different. His inability to connect with his peers left him even more isolated and disillusioned. But the most significant change during these years was his growing desire to control and dominate others. Jeffrey's fascination with death had deepened into something more sinister. He began to develop fantasies about having power over other people, and he started to focus on the idea of capturing and controlling others. This would later manifest in his violent and disturbing acts against young men. The root of his fixation with control, death, and manipulation was planted in these formative years, driven by his feelings of helplessness, rejection, and isolation. Though Jeffrey's parents continued to be unaware of the full extent of his troubled mind, they recognized his worsening behavior. His isolation and strange interests were a source of concern, but they didn't know how to intervene or help their son. As their marriage continued to deteriorate, so did their ability to support him emotionally. By the time Jeffrey entered high school, his emotional turmoil was at its peak. His family's neglect and his inability to form any lasting relationships only added to his feelings of abandonment and alienation. The combination of a fractured family life, emotional instability, and a growing obsession with death marked the beginning of Dahmer's transformation into a killer. The path he would take seemed inevitable, given the circumstances of his upbringing. His strange fascination with death, which began as a child's curiosity, would soon evolve into something far more dangerous. As his isolation grew deeper and his need for control intensified, the foundation was set for the horrific events that would later unfold. What began as a troubled childhood was slowly turning into a life marked by darkness, violence, and destruction. In the years following his high school graduation, Jeffrey Dahmer's life took an even darker turn. After a brief stint in the Army, which ended in a discharge due to his escalating alcohol problems, he returned to live with his father in Bath, Ohio. His mental health was in free fall, and the strange, violent urges that had been simmering beneath the surface for years began to intensify. It was clear that Dahmer's struggles were no longer just about loneliness or addiction. Something much darker was driving him, a need to exert power over others, to dominate and destroy. Living with his father was a temporary solution at best. Dahmer's alcoholism and erratic behavior alienated him from his family and those around him. Lionel Dahmer, despite his best efforts to help his son, couldn't bridge the emotional distance that had grown between them. Dahmer's sense of hopelessness continued to deepen as his addiction to alcohol worsened. During this time, he also began to harbor darker fantasies. His earlier obsession with dead animals shifted toward more extreme thoughts of murder. He began fantasizing about controlling his victims, creating a world where he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. The isolation and emotional turmoil Dahmer experienced in his early adulthood set the stage for what was to come next, his first murder. In 1978, just months after being discharged from the military, Dahmer lured a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks to his home. Dahmer offered him a ride, and after they arrived at his house, the two drank beer together. It was during this encounter that Dahmer's fantasies of power and control came to life. After an argument with Hicks, Dahmer snapped. He bludgeoned Stephen Hicks with a dumbbell and then strangled him to death. However, Dahmer's violent urges didn't stop there. What followed next was even more chilling. After killing Stephen, Dahmer took his body inside and proceeded to dismember it. He kept the body parts as gruesome trophies. Dahmer's fascination with the human body and his desire to control and possess his victims led him to take photographs of the dismemberment process, and he would later keep parts of Hicks's body, including his skull, as macabre souvenirs. This murder was not an isolated incident. In fact, it marked the start of Dahmer's killing spree, which would span over a decade and claim the lives of 17 victims. Dahmer's first kill was a brutal and defining moment for him. It wasn't just the act of killing, it was the act of possessing and controlling someone entirely. Dahmer had finally crossed a line, and the murder of Stephen Hicks was just the beginning. Despite the horrific nature of his actions, Dahmer was able to maintain a semblance of normalcy between his murders. He lived an outwardly quiet and ordinary life, holding various jobs and even attempting to form relationships. He worked at a chocolate factory for a period of time and had several brief romantic encounters. However, these attempts to live a normal life were mere distractions from the darker desires that continued to plague him. His capacity to hide his true nature made him even more dangerous. Dahmer's ability to blend in with society allowed him to evade suspicion and live relatively unnoticed. His co-workers, neighbors, and acquaintances had no idea about the twisted violence that occurred behind closed doors. Dahmer even befriended some of his victims before killing them, presenting himself as a likable, harmless individual. He would often buy them drinks or offer them a place to stay, only to lure them into his home, where he would commit unspeakable acts. This duplicity made Dahmer's later crimes even more terrifying. He was a master manipulator, hiding in plain sight, a man capable of maintaining a normal job and social life while harboring a monstrous, uncontrollable need to kill. He created a false persona, an illusion of normalcy that concealed his growing darkness. Each murder, each brutal act of dismemberment only deepened his obsession. His need to dominate and control became more refined, and his confidence in carrying out his crimes grew. What made Dahmer even more unsettling was his apparent lack of remorse. He seemed to view his victims as little more than objects to be controlled and destroyed. The fact that he was able to compartmentalize his violent urges and lead a seemingly normal life for so long only heightened the horror of his eventual capture. By the time Dahmer's killing spree reached its peak, he had committed a series of gruesome murders, each one escalating in brutality. His dark urges had consumed him completely, and there was no turning back. Dahmer's ability to hide his true self and live an outwardly normal life allowed him to continue his reign of terror undetected for years. His life became a haunting reminder of how easily evil can remain hidden beneath the surface of an ordinary existence. Dahmer's ability to compartmentalize his violence and maintain a facade of normality was a central aspect of his monstrous nature. His violent tendencies were no longer just fleeting thoughts or fantasies. They had become an intrinsic part of who he was. And as his obsession with death and control grew, it seemed there was no end in sight to the nightmare he had created. Between 1987 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's murders escalated in both frequency and brutality. What started as a single horrific act spiraled into a chilling spree that would span several years, marking Dahmer's transformation from a solitary and disturbed man into a methodical killer whose acts of violence grew more twisted with each passing year. His victims, mostly young men, were lured into his home under false pretenses. Dahmer would offer promises of money, alcohol, or even a place to stay to those who were most vulnerable, typically individuals who were transient or struggling with their own issues. Once inside his apartment, these men found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Dahmer's method of luring victims was disturbingly effective. He often approached young men, many of whom were struggling with their own circumstances, and used their need for shelter or companionship as a means to draw them into his lair. Once they were in his apartment, he would offer them drinks, sometimes drugging them in order to weaken their resistance. As the victim became intoxicated and vulnerable, Dahmer would overpower them. His favorite method of killing was strangulation, but he also used blunt force trauma or suffocation to end their lives. The brutality of his methods was matched only by the horrifying acts that followed. After killing his victims, Dahmer engaged in necrophilic acts with their bodies, further demonstrating the depths of his depravity. But the horrors did not end there. Dahmer's obsession with control and domination led him to take his killings even further. He would dismember his victims, keeping parts of their bodies as mementos, macabre trophies that he would carefully preserve. In his refrigerator, he kept body parts like severed heads and limbs, and in some cases, he would boil the flesh from the bones in order to keep the skulls intact. His apartment became a gruesome shrine to his victims, filled with body parts, photographs of their dismemberment, and other grisly remnants of his crimes. Dahmer's fascination with the human body was not limited to murder and necrophilia. His darkest experiments involved attempting to manipulate his victims' bodies after their deaths. He attempted to create what he described as zombie-like beings. Using chemicals he had access to, Dahmer would inject his victims' brains with substances in an effort to preserve them and possibly even reanimate them. He hoped to create a state where he could exert complete control over his victims, turning them into mindless, submissive creatures who would never leave him. This experiment was a chilling reflection of his desire not just to kill, but to own and possess another human being entirely. His twisted mind believed that controlling his victims in this way would allow him to fulfill his fantasies of power and dominance over death itself. Dahmer's apartment, which he referred to as the House of Horrors, was a reflection of the depths of his depravity. When police finally raided his apartment in 1991, they were horrified by what they found. The walls were adorned with photographs of his victims at various stages of dismemberment, and remains of at least 11 victims were scattered throughout the apartment. Some of the bodies were in the process of being dismembered, while others had been preserved in gruesome ways. The sheer volume of evidence found in Dahmer's apartment was staggering, and it painted a picture of a man whose obsession with death had consumed him completely. As Dahmer's body count grew, so did his confidence. For years, he had managed to evade suspicion, concealing his true nature behind a facade of normalcy. Dahmer held various jobs, including a position at a chocolate factory, and even tried to maintain relationships with others. On the surface, he seemed like a typical, if somewhat odd individual. But beneath this facade was a calculating, manipulative killer who had mastered the art of blending in while concealing his horrifying activities. He was a man who had perfected the ability to deceive others into thinking he was harmless, even though he was capable of the most brutal and monstrous acts imaginable. His ability to evade the authorities for so long was due in large part to his meticulous planning and his understanding of how to avoid detection. Dahmer knew exactly how to manipulate situations to his advantage, making sure to cover his tracks after each murder. For example, when disposing of body parts, he would boil the flesh from the bones or dissolve the remains in acid, ensuring that they would never be found. His ability to keep his violent actions hidden behind a veneer of normalcy allowed him to continue his spree undetected for years. However, as Dahmer became more confident, his crimes became more brazen. He grew more reckless and even started keeping his victims in more overtly disturbing ways. At times, he would even take his victims out in public after they were dead, creating a chilling sense of detachment from the gravity of his actions. The longer Dahmer went undetected, the more the violence escalated, and his need for power and control grew insatiable. Dahmer was not just a killer. He was a deeply twisted, calculating monster who found satisfaction not just in taking lives, but in controlling and manipulating his victims in unimaginable ways. The horror of his crimes grew exponentially as his twisted mind pushed him to experiment with his victims' bodies and engage in increasingly violent and grotesque acts. His true nature remained hidden behind a mask of normalcy for years, making his eventual capture all the more shocking and horrifying. Dahmer's reign of terror was not just a series of murders. It was a calculated, deliberate campaign to exercise ultimate control over human life and death. By 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's killing spree had escalated to its most horrific point. His acts of violence had grown bolder, his methods more refined, and the body count was continuing to rise. Dahmer's reign of terror, spanning several years, was nearing its end, and it was only a matter of time before he was caught. The breakthrough came when one of his would-be victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape the clutches of the monstrous killer, inadvertently bringing his reign of terror to a sudden and shocking halt. Tracy Edwards had been lured into Dahmer's apartment, just as countless victims had been before him. Dahmer had invited Edwards to his home, offering him a few drinks and a place to relax. The apartment was familiar territory for Edwards. He knew it as a place where he could possibly escape the cold streets and find shelter for a while. However, when Edwards entered the apartment, he quickly realized something was terribly wrong. Dahmer was behaving erratically and had started making advances toward him, creating a tense and threatening atmosphere. As Edwards noticed the unsettling demeanor of his host, his gut instinct told him that he was in grave danger. Dahmer, in his usual way, had attempted to drug Edwards, but Edward, sensing the danger, fought back. During the struggle, Edwards managed to overpower Dahmer briefly, and in a desperate move, he ran out of the apartment, bloodied and terrified, and made his way to the nearest police station. When Edwards arrived at the station, he was understandably shaken. He told the police that he had been drugged and attacked by a man named Jeffrey Dahmer. He led the officers back to the apartment, hoping they could arrest the killer before it was too late. What they found when they entered Dahmer's apartment was beyond their worst nightmares. Upon arrival, the police were confronted with a scene so grotesque that it was almost incomprehensible. Inside the apartment, they uncovered horrific evidence of Dahmer's grisly acts. The apartment was filled with photographs of his dismembered victims, taken at various stages of their mutilation. There were body parts scattered throughout, including human skulls, severed hands, and torsos. The police also found remains of several victims stored in refrigerators, and some parts were boiling in pots on the stove. Dahmer had been methodical in his attempts to preserve his trophies and his experiments, storing body parts in various places around his apartment. The evidence was damning, and Dahmer was immediately arrested on July 22, 1991. His capture marked the end of one of the most horrific killing sprees in American history. However, the full scope of his crimes would not come to light until Dahmer himself began to confess in the days that followed his arrest. In the days after his capture, Dahmer, who had previously managed to maintain a facade of normalcy, was finally forced to face the consequences of his monstrous actions. During his interrogation, Dahmer revealed the full extent of his crimes with chilling detail. He confessed to the murder of 17 young men, most of whom had been killed in brutal, shocking ways. His victims were typically lured into his apartment with promises of money, alcohol, or a place to stay. Once inside, Dahmer would drug them, strangle them, and then dismember their bodies in his private house of horrors. He admitted to engaging in necrophilic acts with his victims and even preserving parts of their bodies as mementos of his sickening acts. Dahmer's confession revealed his deeply twisted motives. He admitted that he was driven by a desire to dominate and control his victims. His killings were not simply acts of violence, they were acts of possession. Dahmer explained that his need to kill was rooted in his overwhelming feelings of loneliness and rejection. He described how he longed for complete control over another human being, someone he could keep for himself and never let go. His obsession with power and control was so profound that it led him to conduct disturbing experiments with his victims' bodies, including injecting chemicals into their brains in an attempt to create zombie-like beings that would remain under his control. What was even more chilling than the murders themselves was Dahmer's apparent lack of remorse. He spoke candidly about his crimes, revealing how he had planned and executed them methodically over the years. He made no effort to hide the details of his brutal actions, and his confession was filled with an eerie detachment. Dahmer even described how he felt a sense of relief after each murder, as if he had rid himself of the emptiness and loneliness that had tormented him for so long. In the weeks following his arrest, Dahmer was examined by psychologists who concluded that while he was capable of understanding the gravity of his actions, he lacked empathy for his victims. He had been diagnosed with various personality disorders, including borderline personality disorder, but his primary motivation for the killings seemed to be his insatiable need for control and domination. Dahmer's capture sent shockwaves through the nation as people struggled to comprehend how someone who appeared to be an ordinary, albeit eccentric man could be capable of such unimaginable horrors. His arrest and confession opened the door to a deeper understanding of the darkness that had taken root within him. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Dahmer had evaded detection for so long, further adding to the horror of his crimes. His case became a symbol of the disturbing reality that monsters can live among us, hidden in plain sight, masked by the facade of normality. Dahmer's arrest marked the end of his reign of terror, but the psychological scars he left behind, both in the families of his victims and in the public psyche, would last long after he was locked away in prison. In 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer stood trial for the heinous crimes he had committed over several years. The trial became one of the most infamous in American history, drawing widespread media attention as the full scope of his gruesome actions came to light. Dahmer's defense team attempted to argue that he was insane, seeking to have him committed to a psychiatric institution instead of sending him to prison. They claimed that his violent urges were the result of deep psychological issues, suggesting that he lacked the capacity to understand the wrongfulness of his actions. However, the jury was not convinced by this defense. The evidence was too overwhelming, and Dahmer's calm, calculated confession to the police made it clear that he understood the gravity of his actions. Dahmer was convicted of 15 murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His convictions included the brutal killings of young men, most of whom were lured into his apartment under false pretenses, only to be murdered, dismembered, and in some cases, preserved as trophies. Dahmer's ability to live among the public undetected for so long added a chilling dimension to his crimes. The trial proceedings revealed just how deeply disturbed Dahmer had been, yet also how intelligent and calculating he was. The defense's claim of insanity did not match the horrific precision with which he carried out his murders. On February 17, 1992, Dahmer was officially sentenced to life in prison. For a time, it seemed as though his reign of terror had come to an end, but his life behind bars would be far from peaceful. Dahmer's incarceration at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, would be short-lived. Though Dahmer had been convicted of 15 murders, the tragedy of his actions did not end with his conviction. On November 28, 1994, just a few years after his sentencing, Dahmer was killed by a fellow inmate while serving his prison sentence. Dahmer's death occurred during a routine work detail. He had been assigned to clean a bathroom alongside two other inmates, one of whom, Christopher Scarver, would later be responsible for Dahmer's death. According to Scarver, Dahmer had taunted other inmates by imitating the sounds of his victims and making disturbing jokes about his crimes. This behavior had reportedly angered Scarver, who, along with another inmate, beat Dahmer to death with a metal bar. Dahmer was found unresponsive, with his injuries too severe for him to survive. He died shortly after the attack, bringing an end to the life of one of the most notorious serial killers in history. Dahmer's death, though bringing an end to his reign of terror, did not end the fascination with his story. To this day, his name remains synonymous with horror, violence, and death. The details of his life, crimes, and eventual capture continue to haunt the collective memory of those who followed his case. His story has been the subject of countless documentaries, books, and films, as people continue to try and understand the mind of one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. What made him commit such unspeakable acts? How did a seemingly ordinary man, living among his neighbors and holding down a job, transform into a cold-blooded murderer? These are questions that continue to elude definitive answers, but they remain a part of the public's curiosity about his dark legacy. Dahmer's life and crimes serve as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lie hidden within even the most unsuspecting individuals. On the surface, Dahmer appeared to be an ordinary man, a quiet, socially awkward individual who lived a relatively normal life in his community. Yet beneath this exterior, he harbored a grotesque obsession with death, control, and domination. His story is a stark illustration of how deeply disturbed individuals can conceal their true nature and lead double lives, hiding their darkest impulses until they explode in terrifying violence. Though Dahmer's life ended in tragedy, the scars of his crimes remain etched in the memories of the families of his victims, the police who investigated his case, and the millions of people who followed his story. The legacy of his evil acts continues to cast a long shadow over American criminal history. His case remains a horrifying reminder of the potential for evil that can lurk within ordinary people, often unnoticed until it is too late. Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes were not just a series of random killings. They were a deliberate, calculated attempt to exert power and control over vulnerable individuals. His legacy is one of terror, and the profound impact of his actions continues to shape the way society views criminal behavior, mental health, and the potential for violence. Dahmer's story will never be forgotten, and as the years pass, it remains a dark chapter in the history of America's most infamous serial killers.